one of my favorite myths is that if you have great developers, they will just not create any defects. How long does it take from the inception of an idea to get that idea to your customer? Focus on what adds value to your business right now. All problems in technology at the end of the day are people problems.
Hello everyone, my name is Marcin Kokott and welcome in Product Odyssey, podcast series where we explore how to build digital products fundamentally better. Today we have a pleasure to host Katja Obring, a distinguished trainer, coach and advisor based in the UK with over 18 years of extensive experience. Katja has held key roles such as QA tester, QA engineering lead, consultant and head of delivery. She's a visionary founder of Katja Coaching, where she partners with organizations to enhance their test leadership and strategy consulting. Katja is adept at initiating transformative changes in testing processes. In addition to her consulting work, she offers comprehensive online training programs and has recently launched her latest course on developing test strategy. For more details, you can refer always to the links provided in the show notes. Katja, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Hi, Marcin. It's a pleasure to be here.
We've met on the CTO conference just recently, and I was under huge positive impression from your presentation, and wanted to invite you to discuss the testing topic. And let's set some stage here. So I would assume that we are developing products for more than already 25, 30 years in a agile manner or any kind of modern manner. But still we can imagine the situation that we are trying to build a product, tirelessly bringing the product to the market, trying to fight for the months to actually make everything happen. And then on the launch date, the excitement is in the air, but we see that something goes wrong. So we have defects that are putting our reputation at stake. Everything is not working. We are complaining about that. We are back to the drawing board trying to fix that. And it sounds like a nightmare, and it sounds like a story of yesterday. But it seems that it's not the case. It's still happening. Any kind of guess or a statement around the fact, is it still the case that we are struggling with having defects in the products all the time?
Because we still struggle with defects in the product, right? And I think there are two sides to this. I think Agile, whilst it is not a new concept, I don't think has necessarily been widely well adopted, right? So I think a lot of organizations, especially big organizations, do something they call Agile, but it is not necessarily super agile, right? So there is still a little bit of the old waterfall around, I find, in a lot of these organizations. There are change approval boards, for example, that kind of thing, right? And then no matter how good you are, there will always be defects. The question is, how early can you catch them, or even better, how well can you prevent them, right? So that is kind of, I think, where we are these days.
Right. And any kind of examples of the failures you have spotted working as a consultant, or any kind of a recent experience around the worst case scenario that can happen?
Well, to be honest, because the teams I work with, we kind of work with quality from the beginning, or building quality in from the start. So we generally find them before launch date, right? It's been a while that I have seen a seriously delayed launch. I have had one where basically it turned out that the authentication system didn't work with the updates we had been making to the system, because they had only been tested in the staging environment. And it turned out at that point that the staging environment, the authentication was configured so differently from the way it was configured in live, that we had issues that we couldn't have found in staging because it was simply apples and pears, right? And that is a problem that to one extent or the other, I see quite often still, where you have, especially if they are hosted solutions, right, and not cloud solutions, where you can spin up an environment that is basically mimicking, your live environment very well. If you have a staging environment that is manually managed, then quite often I see discrepancies between staging and production that can lead to all sorts of fun defects.
Yeah, we've seen that more than we would like to admit, probably.
Yeah.
And that's the case. So we're talking about the situations where the staging is different than the production, or the fact that we are implementing agile approach and it's not too, let's say it's not done correctly in a way. But we also sometimes struggle with those kind of like the myths that we have, or the anti-patterns people still have in their heads. Just assuming if you have any kind of examples of those kind of myths or seen things that you see in the market that people still believe in.
Well, so one of my favorite myths is that if you have great developers, they will just not create any defects, right?
Oh, right. Yes.
If you're just good enough, if you write good enough code, then there will be no defects, which I think is really, really interesting. So all the great developers I have worked with are very well aware that if you write code, you will be creating defects. That is just, it is like if you breathe, you will be creating carbon dioxide.
Correct.
It's just how it works, right? You cannot do the one without the other. And I think that is one of the biggest myths I still come across occasionally, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that's actually probably connected also with the fact that it's we tend to not remember or tend to forget that this is research and development, right? So as with any other industry, we cannot expect it's like with the surgery. It's not the case that you enter the surgery and you don't expect that they will be testing. It's a procedure which is repeatable. Research means that it's something innovative. Yeah. So you will make mistakes and you need to try to find the defects and fix them. The only case is that we need to find them early because they cost more, right? If you find them later.
Exactly. And I think there is also a thing where if you have a very, very simplistic application, then your chances of writing relatively defect-free code are much higher. But the more complex your application gets, the lower the chance is, because you get to a point where no one person can really hold systemic information about the whole system in their head. Mm-hmm. There will be missing details about certain parts, and that just means things will go wrong, right? So it is really important that you have a mechanism in place that can catch the things that will go wrong quickly, early, and that you have a mechanism in place where you know how to deal with them, right?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good point, right? So we need to, when we are trying to debunk this myth, we see that the idea of good developer writing a great code without the defects, it's still possible, right? But under some circumstances, and we need to remember that. So simple system, relatively easy domain, or very slow process of development, right? It's still possible. We can assume that, right? That the developer can test. But it's about the speed and about the complexity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that brings me to actually my second myth that I have always seen in the market, and that's the fact that we are bringing testers to destroy or to in some way to test the product, so to find out how we can destroy it. So there is this kind of myth that people are always, like testers are always complaining and not doing really any kind of productive work, but they are still saying this is not working correctly.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that is something, unfortunately, that is still alive and well out there. So I think there is a school of testing that very much, which I personally consider a little bit old-fashioned, right? Which very much focused on finding all the weaknesses and pointing out all the defects, which is a function of testing, of course. But I think modern testing really focuses on helping teams build in quality. And by building in quality, it means we work with developers to talk about what kind of automated tests we want to write. We talk about what kind of test cases we need to cover. It also means even earlier, we sit in on design discussions and make sure that we're really clear on the requirements. Because I think, I don't know if there's any science behind this, but I've heard this from a number of people now. There is this kind of information out there that about 80% of production bugs ultimately are the result of misunderstandings between design and implementation. So the earlier we can clarify that with concrete examples where we can talk concretely about, okay, this is the problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to solve it by our application doing this precise thing. And these are the precise steps we want to verify and want to make sure that they, that our application does exactly these things and not other things, right? The earlier we can do that, the higher our chance is to not build in defects, really.
It is perfectly okay, right? I'm trying to dig deeper here to find out any kind of maybe fundamentally different approach, or basically this kind of hints for C-level executives to understand it better, the topic, and make better decisions. So it's totally okay to dive deeper. And actually, following that, I'm trying to explore a little bit this idea. Probably I will need to find out the science behind and the numbers of this 80%. But based on the research and Chaos Standish Group reports and the market researches, it seems it's possible. You would need to add to that also the numbers of, or the fact that later in the production or the lead time end-to-end flow that you find the defects, it's going to be multiply the effort and the cost of fixing that defects. So the cost grows with that. But ultimately, it is basically the most defects are happening due to the fact that we are trying to envision how this will work. We are not trying to cover how this shouldn't work, or we are missing some edge case. And you cannot find it through just thinking long enough as a developer, right? Yeah. Or as a single person even, especially in the complex systems.
Exactly. Like you say, I think a lot of building quality applications boils down to good communication within the team and good communication within people who wear different hats, right? So I'm not necessarily sure that you, for example, and this is, if you saw my presentation at the CTO CraftCon, I'm not saying you necessarily need to have a dedicated tester on your team, but you need to have one person in these conversations who thinks about quality and who thinks about testing, and who pushes this in a strategic approach.
Right, and that's a pretty interesting statement, right? So you don't need to have a tester. Again, we're doing a circles here, but it's around the same topic, that it's not the fact that dedicated tester is the must-have. It's about the probably putting the effort on the person who is skilled better for the job and can actually can do that more efficiently. So on the lower cost for the project itself also. But that brings me to this kind of maybe human factor that will appear when we are thinking about those kind of different two roles. So as a developer, I want to create and I want to do it fast. And then as a tester, I want to find out what is not working, or as a quality person that will be assigned there. Isn't that, from your experience, causing any kind of like turbulences or basically tensions that tester is collaborating with the developer?
Well, see, that's exactly kind of what I say. So I don't really see it that way. I think quality really is everybody's job, right? But if you have a conversation that one person needs to play the role of the person who looks specifically at quality, like let's say you bring two people together. One is the developer who focuses on the implementation details, and the other person at the same time thinks about what risk is connected if we implement it that way. What is the worst that can happen? How can we prove, if we implement it this way, that it actually works? And how can we prove this doesn't have a negative effect in some other part of our system? Right? So there is traditionally a lot of tension between QA and developers. There is no doubt about that. But I think this is partially because of what we said earlier, this perception that testers are there to kind of put on the brakes and to only moan about all the broken things, right? And I don't think that modern testing really is that. Again, this is always part of it, right? But I don't think that is the focus of modern testing. I think the focus of modern testing really is a much broader approach to quality.
Yeah, it totally makes sense, and I wanted to explore that more. But before that, just wanted to move back to this one concept, because the audience that we are targeting is actually C-level or the startup owners. And if you look at it from this perspective, there is always a question of as a startup owner, especially if I'm assembling a team, I need to find out a good developers or good people to join my team. Finding developer is relatively easy from the concept perspective. It's hard to get a good person, but it's relatively easy probably to describe. But when we are talking about hiring a tester, there are two questions that arrive, right? Should I hire a tester in the beginning if I'm starting a project, if I'm starting a company? Is it the first choice from the cost perspective? And second of all, what kind of attributes I should look at a good tester? What is the distinctive tester actually recognized by?
So as many things, right? It depends. But I would say that bringing in a tester or a person that can cover this tester role early in is a good idea for a number of reasons. Partially because, you know what they say, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So if you don't build in this quality culture from the start, it will be much harder and much more expensive to do that later.
Right.
So at the very least, you want to think about what strategic approach you want to take to quality. And it is okay if you're a very early stage startup to say quality is not our main focus, but we do need a functioning application that we can demonstrate to potential investors, for example. Right? So that is a different level of quality than, say, you're an established financial institution and thousands, millions of people depend on you handling millions, maybe billions of transactions every day correctly. That is a different level of quality you need to think about. But think about you need in either situation, right? So what I think is that it is important to bring in, especially for early stage startups, to bring in somebody who has some other skills than just testing, right? So you don't want to bring in somebody who is just kind of used to working at this end of the line. You give them a build and they test the build. You need somebody who is ideally at least proficient in enough coding that they can write test tools, some test automation maybe, that they can speak the same language as developers speak, so that they have a platform they can communicate about a sane level of test automation, for example. Again, this will depend on what your audience is, how much audience you have, and so forth. And I think a good tester can think strategically about these things, right? So you want somebody who is also interested in the whole process of delivery, CI/CD. They need to understand that, in my opinion. They probably need to understand good agile process as well and can help the team hone in on that, right? So I think they are fairly versatile people.
That's perfectly what I'm looking for, right? And to explore that areas. And actually wanted to follow that thought. And in the situation that I'm a startup owner, I'm on a budget, and I need to think about consciously around should I actually hire another developer and speed up the time to market, or should I already think about a team consisting of a separate tester, and should I think about the going for manual tester or automation tester already? Is there any kind of like a rule of thumb that you would advise, or what to look at for this kind of situation as a startup owner beginning on the journey?
Well, that's what I'm saying, right? You don't want to hire somebody who is what you would call a separate tester. You don't want to hire somebody who can do nothing else but testing. As an early stage startup, I would probably look for a developer who has interest in testing or a testing background or something like that, right? I would look for somebody who is a little bit more versatile in my team, but still can give me that focus on quality that we are talking about.
Okay, and then if we take that, probably again it's a rule of thumb, but what would be the course of action in the way that this developer should do the manual testing, unit testing, and then system testing? Should he think about the automation, or should I think already about the automation and sending that up, or is it like a later stage in the project?
Again, it is not one person who should be thinking about testing. Everybody on the team needs to be thinking about this. There's just one person who is kind of, taking the spearhead. I am a huge proponent of automating everything that makes sense to automate, right? So not everything, but you want, so to begin with, you don't want to write code that doesn't have unit tests, and that is a hard and fast rule. There are very few exceptions. There is code that really doesn't do things that you need to unit test. That's fine, but it's generally speaking, everything that you want, every functional test you want to be repeatable should be an automated test that runs in the CI/CD pipeline. There is always a certain amount of manual testing that you want to happen. You want humans interact with your product, right? But again, this is not a manual tester that should be doing this. This should be everybody on the team, but specifically product people can very well do what we call exploratory testing, because they need to check that what has been built meets their idea of what the product should be anyways. So that is a perfect time to just combine these things. And to be fair, a lot of product people I have worked with, they will be using the application day in, day out anyways. So there is absolutely no reason why that cannot be the manual exploratory testing. Right.
Right. It could be the part of the job, and it should be the part of the job. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So there is no reason that that you separate those things, right? There may be a benefit in those in training people a little bit in testing methods and heuristics you can use. Totally, right? But I don't think that those need to be separate activities.
Okay, and that's actually putting me back to the statement that you've mentioned around the fact that I agree totally with that. That's this is not the quality is not the role of single person. You cannot build in quality through work of individual. It's a team effort. So we have talked about the PM actually doing exploratory testing, or the developers also thinking from the quality standpoint. But again, just to not leave the startup owner hat here, or the small business that we are running in, any kind of practical approach, what would be like a 3 steps you would take to make sure that the quality mindset and the culture is there? Because we always say that it needs to be there, it's obvious, you think about the quality, but any kind of practical steps as a hint for the startup owners.
Yeah, so number one, as I said before, think about quality strategically. So have a test strategy. You don't need a test plan or anything like that. You don't need to have defined test cases. But I think you need to have a strategy that defines what kind of risk you're willing to take, where you think the main risks lie in your application, and how you're planning to mitigate those. Right? That's the first one. Revisit that. Mm-hmm. At least yearly, because your audience will change. That means your quality levels will need to adapt, right? 2, have a good development practice. So make sure that you have clear rules for what is and isn't okay in development. Like I said, unit test is one, static code test is another one. A CI/CD pipeline that automatically runs those unit tests is one, right? And then there's probably number 3, which is very neglected, but for me falls in the same category. Actually, have a good disaster recovery strategy, because things will go wrong.
Oh yeah.
And it is part of your quality. It is part of the quality perception for your audience, how quickly and how well you can recover if something goes wrong. Right? If you have a 2-minute timeout, outage is a different thing than you have a 24-hour outage to your systems.
Oh, right. I always remember that have seen the cases where, as we are working with the startups, that the whole process for capturing defects is there, and it's basically working fine, only to the extent that the priority of the bugs is only set like a number. It's high, low, medium, without any kind of assessment of the impact or urgency. And that's something that I have seen many times too often, that we are prioritizing things which are not so impactful, and omitting those that are like impact only for one person, but it's stopping the whole system, right?
Yeah.
Just wanted to to move back to those 3 points, because you've started with the test strategy and practical approach for that. You've mentioned that we need to have the risks area covered. Is it, just to confirm, is it the look for the product and defining which kind of parts of the product are risky and we should take care more, put more effort there? Or is it rather like listing risk management, listing all the things that can go wrong or things that could go wrong and having a mitigation plan for that? Or is it a mix of those?
Well, yeah, well, I think it's a mix. I mean, if you want to develop a strategy, it is a good idea to start with listing all of the risks, but then you probably want to pick maybe 3 that you consider your main risk right now, right? You want to have awareness of what else lurks in the background. And like I say, as your application develops, as your audience base develops, as your goals as a business develop, there may be shift in this list, right? Something that was really, really a high risk for you yesterday may not be tomorrow. Whereas something else, a good example, for example, is that kind of ties in with a recovery strategy, is a lot of companies, in my experience, far too early focus on uptime metrics, right? And then people go like, oh yeah, we need to have 99% uptime, which for most businesses is completely unnecessary, is incredibly expensive, is a lot of work for very little benefit. Lower it down to 95%. It's much, much easier to achieve. It's much easy, and for most applications it's perfectly fine. If lives don't depend on you and people's wealth doesn't depend on you, it's probably fine. Right?
Oh, that's amazing point, right?
That's what I mean.
It's actually moving us to the topic of measuring the quality, and most of the people tend to assume that the quality is the number of defects that we'll find, right? Or maybe the performance of the product. But what you are touching here is the fact that it depends, right? It's not the one metric. For sure it needs to be connected with what is important for you, and what is critical. 100% or the perfect metric, it's not always a goal. It's about how much you want to invest, right?
A metric should never be a goal. I have opinions on that.
That's true.
But that's a different conversation. No, you're totally right. So I usually don't bother, for example, counting defects in my teams. Ideally, that is not always possible, but generally speaking, I very, very hard push for a 0 bug policy, which means we discover a bug, we log it, we either fix it right then and right there, we fix it within the next 2 weeks, or I know that if it isn't important enough to go in a sprint right now to be fixed within the next 2 weeks, we probably will never get around. It just goes into the black hole that we call our backlog. And
oh yeah, I know that.
There is no point in doing that. I also close all tickets that haven't been touched in 3 months, for example. Right, I'm very, very much a proponent of a short backlog, and not have 15. If it is important, it will come back. Don't worry about it. And the tickets don't disappear because you close them. The information is still there, right? It's all good. But it is just so much overhead for the team, and it adds so much stress and pressure to know that you have 10,000 tickets waiting for you. It's just not worth it.
I remember from the past days, and yeah, maybe it's not the history, right? But when we were talking about creation of Scrum Kanban, Henrik Kniberg used to say that the backlog, if I don't change that correctly, wrongly here, the backlog should be really short, because then it's an investment. So longer you see, it doesn't matter to actually, if you invest so huge time, it will die there. So
exactly.
Focus on what is
totally
around the corner.
That, yes. Focus on what adds value to your business right now. That is the only benchmark that counts.
And maybe far-fetched here, but if you would need to point out that you don't know anything about the example project, right, or the product development, what would be like the main metrics you would look for, like a basic metrics to get the understanding of where we are regarding the quality itself? Are there any kind of like a top 3 go-to places or metrics that you would look for?
I think the DORA metrics are always a really good point to start, right? Look at your deployment frequency, look at your time to deployment. So look at how long it takes you, especially if you're a small company. That is I think it's a really important one. How long does it take from the inception of an idea to get that idea to your customer? Because the shorter that is, the sooner you get feedback and the sooner you know if you're actually developing the right thing, which is particularly interesting, of course, for businesses who are still maybe not have found their 100% product market fit, right? At that stage, you are really, you should be looking at taking things to your customers and get feedback on them. I think that is the number one, probably.
Right.
And then, of course, you want to check. You also want to keep track of, do releases actually cause production issues? You want to know how many of your releases cause production issues, right? That gives you a good idea of your overall quality. But I don't think you get better insight when you know, oh, that release had 3 and that release had 2, and then maybe that other one that we found much later, right? So, and counting the number of bugs or defects, I think, is a complete waste of time is maybe a little bit too harsh here. But you want to know how much defects you release, and that should be a low number.
Yeah, and you should know how fast you fix them, right? Or probably there will be, of course, leading metrics there, like identifying if this is recurring or not, if I'm having like a 7 time the same regression. But I agree totally. Number of defects is not comparable. It's like number of hours in estimations. You cannot compare them, and then they don't tell you anything.
And also, and I want to stress this, right? Hang on, I have one more thing to add here, because I think it's important, because you mentioned regressions. So if you have a good, well thought out automation setup, regression happens before you release, right? I mean, it always happens before you release, but it happens as part of the process, ideally multiple times a day, whether you release or not. Every time somebody pushes code to your main branch, you want to run a full set of your automated tests, and that is your regression set that runs every time you add new code, right? Which also means there is no point in counting the bugs that have been found and fixed before things get released. And this is why I stress you want to count the number of bugs that make it to production. Whereas if you just count the number of tickets that have bugs in it, you will probably have a lot of tickets that have been created earlier, right?
Right, yeah. So, due to the communication between the testers and the developers. Yeah. So that's something that we are saying you shouldn't measure, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And also
if you're mentioning
if you catch these bugs as part of your automated test run, then there probably will never be a ticket anyways, because then it is the developer's job anyways. Their tests failed, so they need to go back and fix their code before it can go into the main branch anyways, right? So
yeah, you've mentioned the regression and the fact that maybe it's obvious that we need to run a regression. It needs to run every time you need it, and it's a full set. So I know as a developer that everything is working. But then we haven't mentioned like the expected time for that, and this is probably something that it's not obvious for everybody, and it's case by case, of course. But how long should those regression sets run? What is the benchmark here?
Well, so a lot of people I work with kind of get a little bit of a heart attack when I say I don't want them to run. I think 15 minutes is stretching it, under 10 minutes. Or the way I describe it is, if I push code, and the tests start automatically as part of my pipeline, I want to have enough time to go away, get myself a new drink, coffee, whatever, maybe have a brief chat with somebody I meet on the way, come back, and then I want to see my test results. If my tests run so long, that I start other work before they are finished, they're too long.
To the extreme that we have a situation that, and it's regular that it's happening, that regression tests run in the night because they are so long, right? And we need to wait for them in the morning.
Anti-pattern. I think that is a complete anti-pattern. The point of having an automated test suite is a fast feedback loop. Overnight is not a fast feedback loop, but also it is usually a symptom of having a team that has developers here and what we call these days automation testers, which is a particular pet peeve of mine, but automation testers over here who write the test automation after the developer has finished, right? And then this goes into this suite, which then becomes the nightlies. And some poor person probably has the job coming in the morning and then spending I don't know how much of their time looking at the results from last night, deciding on why the test run abandoned after 3 minutes, because that's what happens if you have a failure early on, then the rest of the test will never run, right? So you have no information about anything that would be running after that. Whether this failure was an actual bug or maybe just, again, a misconfiguration, maybe there was a bit of network wonkiness, right? So I think 8 out of 10, in my experience, defects that are found by these test suites are not actual bugs. They are misconfigurations, network issues, or my favorite, intermittence, which then can't be reproduced, which is usually also network, but there you go. So in other words, what you're doing is you have a team writing a lot of code, because this is code. At the end of the day, this is also code that needs to be maintained, right? Spending a lot of time writing this code, maintaining this code, running this code on infrastructure, which is also not free, right? For very little actual benefit. In my experience, these nightly test suites, if you're lucky, they catch a couple of bugs a week.
Right, so the return on investment is pretty small, right? For
very low.
This huge effort, right? And why is it so?
Exactly.
You've mentioned that that could be the reason that the developers are not sitting, or they are sequential, or they are in the silo and not working with the developers. And I kind of pinpoint to the other causes that could happen, that are causing this kind of situation. That we have so huge test rig, or the regression set that it needs to run in the night.
Well, the other part, of course, is that if you have a separate test team, and often these are offshore or nearshore teams, which are not even really in the same company, right? What happens is they don't have access to your systems. They don't have access to your production code base. So they test the only way they can, and that is often through the UI. So you end up having a whole bunch of tests that are running through the UI and testing stuff through the UI that really should not be tested through the UI. A UI test should be testing the UI and nothing else. But these test suites often test things like, if I enter this, I don't know, I have a text input field, say a username, and I put in the wrong format, does it stop me from proceeding? That is not a UI test. That is a test that should be one test that tests the UI component, because you can check input formats in the component, and the other is an API test that checks that if I send this thing in the wrong format, then I get an error back, and that is the right error in the right, and again, that sends me the right information back, right? That is not a test that you should be running through the UI. A UI test is slow, hard to maintain, very prone to breaking, instead of two tests that are easy to write, easy to maintain, easy to change if anything changes in your application, and they take seconds to run rather than minutes, right? So fractions of seconds probably.
Yeah, I really love the idea that you need to think about the testing from the perspective of the feedback loop, and that's the goal of the testing itself and the building quality. And that I have so fast feedback loops I can react on them, and definitely having nightlies or running them in the night is just justifying that I want to cover everything. So I'm almost proud that I have 70,000 test cases running in the night, right? Because I can automate that.
I have heard that, yes. Yes, I have heard that. People are like, oh, look at this. And like, yeah, you have 17,000 test cases. 16,000 of them probably test stuff that A, should be covered differently, and really don't give you any valuable information back, because at the end of the day, that is what you want from a test. You want information about how your system is performing under controlled circumstances. That's all it is.
That's amazing insight to that, and I would like to put it on the billboard probably somewhere and and pass it through. It's probably makes sense when you see it, and if you are working with developers and if you are a product manager on the team, it's probably not so obvious if you are going higher in the organization and you're on the C level. This is harder than to see and to justify it. You see that the departments are saying that they are proud of the testing suits, and this is what we have found out. This is what kind of tests we have. Any kind of guidelines here or hints for a C-level to people what they should look for or how they should make sure that we are moving in the right direction to not end up with nightlies, to not end up with those kind of silos?
Well, don't start with them, right? So that this kind of leads us back to the build quality in from the start. If you build a culture of quality in the beginning, then you won't end up with this kind of thing later on, right? But you may not have the chance to build it up from the start. So I think the one question that will always get you in the right direction is, how does this help me to get value to my customer faster? You can rephrase that a little bit as, if we had to release this tomorrow, how does this help me to do that?
Oh, that's a good one. Mm-hmm.
I think that is really the question at the end of the day.
And then, of course, you can rely on the metrics and the standards that we have, right? If I have at least implemented DORA metrics and I'm communicating with my departments, it should be easy to at least see the signals. Of course, we don't want to have a target, as we have discussed, that the metric is a target itself, but at least I will have enough insight, right, to that. There is actually, if we're on the seal, there is always one interesting thing. If you start to think from the perspective of money, that you will come up with the interesting questions which are not so obvious, and sometimes, again, it depends. But if I'm actually building a team, it's always the fact that I can clearly justify the developer's costs and they are delivering the functionality. It's harder for me to justify if I have a separate testing person or a testing team doing that, again, to justify that. But from the cost perspective, is there any kind of guidelines on what is the ratio? And maybe there is no answer again, but is there any kind of ratio, how many testers towards developers I should have?
Well, when I started testing 20 years ago, or almost 20 years ago, I think the accepted ratio was 1:5, 1:3, if it's really great. These days, because I don't think, again, I don't think that testing should act as this quality gateway, right? That's not what it is. So again, you have two choices here. You can either, I think, hire somebody who can also write production code, and then this question kind of goes away by itself, right? I think all developers need to be responsible for, and they need to own the testing as well, right? So this is why I'm saying you want somebody who has some specialized knowledge in the team or is happy to acquire it. But still, every developer, if they write code, they need to make sure that all the tests that need to be performed are performed one way or another. They can test manually, they can write automated tests. I don't care, right? But the tests need to be performed. That needs to be in the definition of done. It is tested. Period. The other choice you have is you hire somebody who acts more as a quality advocate, and that can be a person that works with more than one team, because then their job becomes to guide. This works better if you have a fairly mature team of developers who already know how to do this ownership of testing, right? But then you want maybe some person who acts at a slightly higher strategic level and helps the teams figure out what their best strategy is. This is also something you probably want to think about if you have more than one development team, you're slightly bigger, right? Because then you want somebody who looks at quality from a high level and says, okay, this team over there is deploying feature A, but this will probably a conflict with this other team over here that's working on feature B. We need to get that together, and we need to, make sure that they exchange the information that is needed for those two things to work in harmony and not create friction between those two. Because that is another thing that happens quite often, right? That one team does something that then breaks the work of another, and so on and so forth, which also obviously costs a lot of money.
Correct. Great hints, and that actually brings me to probably in the beginning you've mentioned the fact that it shouldn't be the fact that it's sequential, the testing itself, and it shouldn't be that there is an outsourced team which will jump in the end of the process, and this is again waterfall that we're landing in. This brings me to probably the shift left concept, which is nothing new on the market, but still we need to educate probably. And it's still existing there, right? And you are an advocate of that. Can you tell us a little bit like the one-liner for why is it still important and what actually is shift left right now?
Well, shift left, generally speaking, is this, like you say, the idea that testing is not a phase at the end of the process, but happens from the start, right? So if you look at the software development lifecycle, right, left is everything before the deployment. Traditionally, testing sits right, left is this phase, right before deployment, right? But you want to extend testing ultimately because it is, this infinity loop, ultimately that goes everywhere and it also goes right. But let's not get into that right now. So you want to make sure that testing, that is not a one-liner, is it? The testing is performed continuously. So continuous testing is definitely one of the keywords here. Start testing in the design phase is another one. So I personally am a huge fan of story mapping or example mapping. It is known under both words, right? So I think that is really, really a useful technique to shift testing as far left as you can, because then you can have these, what I mentioned earlier, these very clear, focused, detailed conversation about what exactly are we doing here, who are we doing it for, what is the problem we're solving, and how can we prove that we have solved the problem.
That's, at least for me, it's a longer than one-liner, but it's actually covering enough the topic, especially that the fact that it's not only the concept that you are saying, but it's actually practical approach, what I should do, right? The example of the continuous testing and the story mapping is actually pretty good. People tend to say that we need to have testers in the beginning, in the early phases, but we are not mentioning how to do it and what kind of tools to use it to facilitate that. So I love this example. And of course, the fact that it's need to be team effort, not the individual, and especially not a sequential, right, approach.
Well, this is, shameless self-plug here, but this is part of what I do in my courses, right? Because like you say, there was a lot of talk about shifted left and very little talk about do these things to shift it left, right? And people need they need practical advice, and they need a space where they can practice things. Sometimes it depends. If you have a great team, they may be open to these experiments and they will take to it well. But you may also have a team that goes like, nah, we have been doing this for, 15 years like this. I have no desire to change. What do you do with those people, right? What are some techniques that you can employ to start shifting things and improve things, right? So
exactly. Sometimes you need to really have the examples, and you need to have a tool is not always an answer, right? But at least the approach, systematic approach, and the process and practical examples, that's something which is needed to make a change.
exactly.
I love that.
I think a tool, I think,
Go ahead.
We have too much to say, both of us, because you mentioned tools and solutions, right? I think a tool is never the solution, but a tool can be a step towards the solution, right? I don't know who said it. It may have been Kent Beck. Somebody said that all problems in technology at the end of the day are people problems, and that is true. All problems in
yeah.
technology at the end of the day are people problems, right? Sometimes the tool can help shift people's perceptions, and that is great. And by all means, yes, I'm all for it. But really, you need to think about the people behind the tool if you want to have success with that, right?
It's amazing, actually, one liner or a punch in the end to finish with that, because it's opening so many doors that definitely I would like to continue, and unfortunately the episode is not too flexible to put everything in. So definitely I will be looking for actually continuing on that. You've mentioned that you have a new course, and that will be actually published. So my question is, if for the audience, if they want to find it, we'll have it in the show note. But just tell everybody where they can find you, and where they can reach you, and where they can learn about the course.
Yeah, so I have a website that is admittedly needs a little bit of updating. So, but you can always find me on LinkedIn. Probably that is just search Katja Obring, and you will find me. My name is fairly unique. I think there's exactly one of me, as far as I know, anyways. And that gives you a good idea. I publish a lot of content on LinkedIn that will give you a good idea about how I think, what I think about, what I talk about. There is also, because I only open sign up for my courses for a week at a time when I publish a new course, the best way to find it is either subscribe to my newsletter, which is just newsletter.katocoaching.com. That is my website. I'm sure the link will be in the description. And I also have a 5-day free email course for shifting left, which you can sign up, and then you can also get an idea what I talk about in that context, and maybe learn a few things about shifting left at the time if you're interested. But the newsletter is where I announce everything that comes out.
Perfect. I advise everybody to check that out, and learning from this experience. It's really straightforward. At least I remember the presentation. That was remarkable and straightforward from the concept perspective. So lots to learn from you, and I advise everybody to actually look it up. And we'll of course include the show notes in the show notes, all the details. Thank you, Katja. It was amazing to have this discussion. Hopefully it was not the last time. And thank you for coming in. Any kind of last statement or a takeaway you would like to put it for any kind of anybody from our audience to resemble?
Well, I mean, first of all, of course, thanks for inviting me. That was really very enjoyable conversation. Thank you for having me. And I would really stress, I think, the 3 takeaways here, right? Have a test strategy. A test strategy doesn't mean test everything all the time. What it means is you have thought about what quality means to you and how far you will go to ensure that it's present in your product. That's really all it is. I think number 2 would be, don't wait until it's painful to think about testing. If you build in a culture of quality, that will be much, much easier, and it will help you avoid so many problems further down the line. Again, if you combine that with your quality strategy, it can be quite simple and quite straightforward, right? And I think the third one is, have at least one quality champion on your teams. That doesn't need to be a dedicated tester. It can be a dedicated tester. If you're big enough, you want somebody who works on test frameworks, for example. You want somebody who creates some tooling to help the testing. If you're small, it can just be somebody who likes to make sure that their code is covered in well-written tests. Right? I think that would be my main advice.
Perfect. And I would add to that if you see any kind of this kind of syndrome of having the zombies and the nightlies that are happening, so you are waking up in the morning and seeing somebody checking the regressions, set finishing, that's definitely something that should ring a bell, that you should think maybe about the improvement.
If you are having a set of nightly tests and you come in every morning to say 20% fail tests, start by deleting every fail test. Everything that failed more than twice in a row, delete it. Right? You will find out if it was a test that was actually important. I can guarantee you that. But there is no point in trying to maintain stuff that is flaky and keeps falling over those. No value in that. Radical.
Amazing. Opens many doors to follow-up questions, but that's probably a next episode then.
Well, next time.
Thank you, Katja. And thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. We are on YouTube, we are on Spotify and Apple platform. Feel free to send us feedback and any kind of suggestions for future guests also. And thank you very much again for watching. Stay tuned and keep exploring. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.